Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the report. My name is YasminKhatun and I'll be taking a look at the stories that matter to you, discussing news stories from throughout the week and the ones that you've all been talking about. On the report, we love to hear what you think, and to join the conversation, get tweeting using #TheReport. Later on the programme, we'll be going through the topics that have been trending throughout the week. Before we get into the conversation, let's have a quick look at some of the latest news.
After more than a year of political turmoil, Mali celebrated the inauguration of its new democratically elected president, Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. Various heads of state, from Chad to the French President François Hollande, arrived in the capital Bamako for the occasion. After his landslide win in last month's runoff, he has said national reconciliation is his government's highest priority.
To all the ones who have experienced horror, the nightmares of our recent history, I want to promise this will never happen again.
The country was plunged into chaos last year after an Islamist revolt led to a coup. Islamists took control of the northern half of the country. Military intervention by France in January crushed the movement. French President François Hollande warned of the potential dangers in the region.
I won't stay holding back in regards to what's happening in Central Africa. Why? Because from chaos comes terrorism. Because what was just at the beginning, a new coup d'etat, became, from a certain point of view, a religious confrontation.
Answering questions on the conflict in Syria, he added,
In Syria, we must manage to find a political solution, because only a political solution will allow us to end what is the biggest massacre of the early 21st century.
The Syrian Deputy Prime Minister says the civil war has reached stalemate, with neither side strong enough to win. Speaking this morning, Qadri Jamil said Damascus would call for a ceasefire with the opposition. This comes as President Bashar al-Assad announced that the cost of ridding the country of chemical weapons would surpass $1 billion, referring to a US and Russian deal reached last week. Assad said his government would dispose of its chemical weapons arsenal, but that it would take about a year. Earlier this week, UN chemical investigators confirmed the use of sarin gas in an attack on civilians. The Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has vowed on Wednesday that his government will never develop nuclear weapons, his strongest signal yet that he may be seeking a diplomatic thaw with the West after decades of acrimony. Both Rouhani and Obama are attending the United Nations General Assembly next week. Here in London, protests were held in front of the Iranian embassy in support of men currently awaiting execution. Human rights organisations are concerned about the country's human rights record. Protesters feared this weekend for individuals the Iranian government has said were acting against the state.
Today we are here in front of the Iranian embassy just to demonstrate against the execution and the penalty of sentencing Muslim Sunni in Iran. There are more than 25 prisoners, Sunni, Iranian, and they are now in a threat of death. They may kill them on Saturday, the coming Saturday, day after tomorrow, that is 18th or 19th of September, and there is no charge for them. They have done nothing wrong. They are not criminals. They are unarmed. They are civilians, and some of them are real shuyukh. They are leader of the Salah, and this indicates how the regime, the Iranian regime, the Shi'i Iranian regime, hating the Sunni and the Muslimin.
Francis Legg reporting for Islam Channel.
Now, a lot of stories to discuss there. With me to discuss some of those stories is Lindsey German from Stop the War Coalition and Arnaud Mafille from CagePrisoners. Also joining us later in the studio will be activist Dujanah and via Skype, Naima B. acclaimed author and editor of global magazine Sisters. Now, Brother Arnaud, tell me more. What's happening? We've heard about 11 prisoners being released.
Alhamdulillah wa salatu wasalam ala nabiyyina Muhammad. It's true that some prisoners have been released, political prisoners, but what is more worrying is the case of these Sunni prisoners. Dozens of Sunni prisoners are still held in Iranian prisons. We know that four of them might be executed as early as tomorrow. What is really interesting or concerning is that those prisoners, of course there's the rhetoric of terrorism, etc., etc. They've accused of having participating into the killing of a Sunni cleric. Now, those prisoners, they were already in prison when that cleric was killed. What it seems is that they're in prison and facing execution because they've been actively spreading Sunnism and defending the beliefs of Al-Sunnah wal-Jama'ah, which they feel has been publicly insulted. Now, they're not armed people, they're simply concerned Muslims that are trying to defend their beliefs. They've been extensively tortured in prison and before that. So that's really based on torture confession. Another thing is that their death sentence was given to them in 10 minutes. They were taken to the court, blindfolded and shackled, and within 10 minutes the judge has given them a death sentence. And since then they've been held in horrendous conditions.
Lindsey, we've just heard Arnaud tell us a little bit about the situation there. Now, we've seen demonstrators come out in London to try and protest what is happening. Is this something that we should be doing? Can we have an impact from here?
Well, I think it's obviously, I'm against all death penalty, and I think it's obviously a very serious case, and people have been out demonstrating on it. I guess that for lots of people in London, they may not be aware of this particular case, and obviously one of the things that's happening with the demonstrations is to try to make it more widely known. But this is something I think that all of us should be against, this kind of repression and against these kind of penalties, because particularly on the grounds, as you're saying, of religious differences, it seems to me that there's absolutely no justification for that.
Arnaud, you mentioned torture. I know you work for CagePrisoners. Of course, this is something that your organisation is very much involved with and tries to campaign against. What can be done now?
Well, basically, those people, they've been tortured and they have no voice because they were held in solitary confinement. But we have a voice. So there's a petition that can be signed online. That's www.supportmybrothers.com. And there's also an urgent appeal that's been done by Amnesty International. So you can write a letter to the Iranian authorities asking them to release them, to investigate the torture and to stop the execution.
Amnesty International said that they weren't represented by lawyers in their court case.
That's right. They had no right. There was no arrest warrant when they were arrested. They had no lawyer. They were tortured and they're held in solitary confinement. They have no access to medical treatment. They're regularly beaten up and insulted mainly to their religious beliefs. So there are people without a voice, but we are free and we are outside and we have to be their voice.
Now, Lindsey, we saw another story there. Bashar al-Assad saying $1 billion and a year in order to get rid of these chemical weapons.
Well, I feel with this that chemical weapons do take a long time to decommission. The whole question of chemical weapons anywhere, once they're produced, they obviously have all sorts of environmental effects, they have all sorts of health effects, and therefore it's a very, very big job. I do think it is an important development that, following on from the vote in Parliament, which voted against attacking Syria militarily, that there now are signs that people are looking for a different sort of solution here. And the point that was made on the news clip that we need some kind of political solution there, you know, that if you look at most wars end in some sort of negotiation, some sort of political solution. People don't like it because obviously if you're involved in a war, there are different sides and there's a great deal of enmity between people. But the truth is this has had a terrible toll in terms of people dying, in terms of refugees, in terms of the humanitarian crisis, and we have to try to solve it.
We saw there in that news clip the Deputy Minister saying that it's almost come to stalemate. The rebels as well as government forces, there's been no movement.
that's been my assessment for quite a long time, and I think a lot of people's assessment is that the Assad regime isn't in a position to defeat the opposition, but nor are they in a position to defeat him, and therefore this is a kind of stalemate which can only come to some kind of political solution.
Now, a year to rid themselves of chemical weapons. We know before this particular use of sarin gas, which the UN has reported, there's over 100,000 death cases in Syria. Now, even if he was to rid himself of chemical weapons, is this enough being done by the international community?
Let's remember that chemical weapons are abhorrent weapons and should be banned and shouldn't be allowed, and most countries have signed up to it. Most countries don't decommission their chemical weapons. Indeed, the United States has refused repeatedly to decommission its chemical weapons. But of course, most people in this war and in most wars aren't killed by chemical weapons. They're killed by conventional weapons. And, you know, the idea that somehow these are uniquely terrible weapons, they're not. When Britain has Trident nuclear submarines, where the United States has nuclear weapons, where Israel has nuclear weapons, we have to get this into proportion, I think.
The UN General Assembly is set to have their meeting next week. What are we hoping for?
Well, I don't know what will happen at the General Assembly, but I guess that most people there will want some kind of settlement and will want to try to bring some sort of peace conclusion to the situation. I mean, after all, this has been going on for 2.5 years. It's not to the benefit of anybody in Syria. It's not actually developing anywhere. It is a stalemate, and I think therefore a ceasefire would be an important step forward. What will happen at the UN General Council isn't at all clear, and of course the whole question about having a year and so on is probably one that will be contested there. That's my guess with it. But of course there's also talks of Geneva too, of the Geneva peace talks, and it seems to me that will be something that lots of people at the UN will be working towards.